This conference will now be recorded.
Excellent. All right, hello everybody. As Sarah said, my name is Scott. I'm a park ranger with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District, based out of the Maritime Visitor Center here in Duluth. And today I'm doing a program I've been wanting to do for a long time. It's on the history of Great Lakes fleets, basically a general history of how the fleets that we have today, how they came to be, how they were formed. Um, it might be a little bit different than when you're expecting. When you look at any kind of maritime history articles in any of the magazines around the Great Lakes, they usually focus on particular people, ships, or fleet histories, but there's not really any good generalized history of how the fleets developed together in general. So that's what this program will kind of tackle here. And it's not going to be all encompassing, unfortunately. As I made this program, I realized more and more that there's just so much to talk about that I have to kind of split it up into sections. This is going to be kind of a part one, so we might hopefully get a part two or even a part three, because there's a lot of stuff that isn't mentioned yet. Um, a lot of the major fleets today, a lot of their beginnings go back to the late 19th century, so the late 1800s or early 1900s, depending. And this program is going to cover kind of the history leading up to that, the development of the modern fleets that we have today. So this presentation overall, I'll try to keep it to 30 to 45 minutes. I love this topic. I can talk about it all day. So we're going to try to keep it brief. And again, it's going to be actually more focused on the American fleets, which were kind of dominant in the Great Lakes from the period 1800 to 1901. But I would like to do a part two or three where I can actually focus on when the Canadian fleets become more dominant, which is leading up to the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 through today. And again, this is going to be a broad overview. It's not necessarily going to be a history of each fleet individually. It's going to be broad. And I try to use some of the major fleets as examples throughout, but there's going to be a lot of interesting points about what led to their development, basically. But I'm covering basically from 1800 to about 1901 in the presentation, basically from the fur trade era to the formation of U.S. Steel and the Pittsburgh Steamship Company. So there's a lot to talk about just in that period alone. So to get the conversation started here, one of the first major commercial industries on the Great Lakes was the fur trade. And it wouldn't be appropriate, I think, to just skip over the fact that these companies that were operating on the Great Lakes had their own fleets. A fleet being owning more than one vessel, multiple vessels owned by a single entity or multiple entities that are owned for operations. And in this case, the American Fur Trade Company was a huge force that came onto the scene about 1808. Before they came onto the scene, the Great Lakes were dominated first by the French and then the British. The Northwest Trading Company, which the flag is shown there, that red flag with the Great Britain kind of corner flag there. They were the dominant fur trading post besides, or one of the dominant, I should say. Hudson Bay Company was also dominant. But these companies are kind of the earlier huge corporate examples of corporations we have today but they're interesting because they're state sanctioned. So, for example, Hudson Bay was state sanctioned by the British Empire, of course. American Fur Trading Company, when that was founded in 1808, John Jacob Astor, who you can see in that painting there, had to get permission from Thomas Jefferson to form the company. So I would call that having official state backing. of the formation of these early companies. And the American Fur Trade Company, after the War of 1812, the American Fur Trade Company basically had control over all the American parts of the Great Lakes. Before the War of 1812, there were a lot of British posts in areas that they weren't supposed to be, and those were officially illegal and basically kicked out after the War of 1812. And of course, the fur trade is all surrounding the beaver pelts. And the reason being, in Europe, it was very stylish at the time to have a beaver felt hat. So the fur trade actually helped create the American Fur Trade Company is one of the early huge companies. John Jacob Astor actually became one of the first millionaires in the United States because of this company, all the money he made just off of the beaver pelts. But focusing on their fleet, um, they had several small schooners, sailing vessels that they controlled. They built and controlled on all the Great Lakes. And these vessels were used to basically transport supplies to and from their various trading posts and stations that they had all over the Great Lakes. They were pretty small, 50 to 100 feet or so. They were basically the first major commercial vessels. The fur trade had the first major commercial vessels on the Great Lakes. And before that, we just had the British naval vessels as well as American naval vessels. But we also, of course, had the huge fleet of smaller Montreal canoes for the fur trade. But a good example of kind of what these vessels look like, that vessel in the picture there is the Algonquin, which is a famous vessel for Lake Superior, built in 1839. It wasn't owned and operated by the American Fur Trade Company, but the company that built that vessel wanted to compete with American Fur, so it was very similar to the vessels that company had. And it basically lived on Lake Superior because the Sulaks didn't exist yet, meaning that there was no easy way to get across the St. Mary's Rapids. But the vessel would stay on Lake Superior, transporting supplies and bringing back furs. And later, they became major fishing stations once the fur trade began to die off. And that vessel would go to and from the different locations on Lake Superior alone. Um, as to how many vessels the American Fur Trade Company actually owned and operated, I was trying to look some of this information up, and it looked like maybe about 10 or more over time. Definitely several. Um, Again, this is one of the earliest versions of what we would have as a fleet on the Great Lakes. So it's a very interesting version that would basically be used later on um, as an example to build on for up and coming developments. So this is kind of an important slide to kind of go over what we're dealing with here, how the vessels operated on the Great Lakes at the time, and where we came from in terms of the fleets that we have today. So if we're looking at the mid 19th century, we had a lot of sailing vessels going around the Great Lakes that were pretty much independent. They would have multiple owners, but the captain on these vessels had a very bigger role than they do today, where they actually were the manager, the accountant, so they dealt with paying the crew and hiring crew. The captain served as the agent for the vessel, so they were the ones looking for cargoes, deciding what cargoes to go for, depending on how much money they can make. They were also part owners, so a lot of captains on the Great Lakes had part ownership or full ownership of the vessels that they worked on. So they helped finance their construction, depending on individual cases. That wasn't always necessarily the case, but it was pretty common. They were all in one sailors. They basically ran the whole vessel as their own business, and had a small crew. And all the crew, as well as the captain, were highly trained sailors, so they were able to do absolutely everything. to the point where some of the sailors would be able to take over from the captain over time, as the captain maybe moved to a different vessel or decided to sell their ownership, that sort of thing. But they were highly independent compared to today's captains. Today's captains have um, still a lot of responsibility, but they aren't necessarily what the fleets have for like offshore management, where they have people onshore managing what the ships are doing. That wasn't the case in these days. Owners that weren't captains were basically kind of just quietly invested, like a investment banker. They weren't necessarily yet involved highly with the vessel's operation. So that's kind of important to uh, point out here. In these two photos here, we just have what a small crew on a schooner might look like. That's from 1901, so that's a little bit more later into the early 1900s, but it's a good example. And then Captain Maurice Fitzgerald was a famous schooner captain on Lake Ontario, and that's his picture. So just to give a visual of what these people looked like typically. So, what we have with the introduction of steam on the Great Lakes is just a ton of changes that happened, and it actually led to the development of the fleets. And I'll explain why in a second. The first steamboats that were on the Great Lakes were built and operated in 1817, both on the Canadian and American sides. We have the American Ontario that began operating on Lake Ontario, and the Canadian Frontenac that began operating um, on the Canadian side. And this was before we actually had vessels coming through, especially on the Erie Canal. That wasn't completed yet. So a lot of the early steam business happened on Lake Ontario. That's where a lot of the development happened first. And obviously, Lake Superior being the furthest Great Lake in the system, that's the kind of the latest lake that had commercial development. And just to talk a little bit about how crazy the how revolutionary the steam introduction of steam to the Great Lakes was, we have a little bit of comparison here. So if we look at the typical sailing vessels of the day, um, these are kind of some characteristics that we can what do you want to call it compare. Sailing vessels obviously were slow, a little less predictable and unreliable with sailing time, so cargo could have a longer time getting to a destination than previously thought. Weather plays into sailing vessels and their operation a lot more than steam vessels. But as we talked about, they have a smaller, highly skilled crew. With schooners, it can be kind of expensive because they typically needed tows from tugs through the rivers and harbors. And because these vessels were slow, they were more focused on the bulk freight cargoes, which didn't necessarily need to be at a port at a certain time, like grain, coal, lumber, that sort of thing. When the steamships came up onto the lakes, they were revolutionary because they were much faster and more reliable sailing times. Basically, this created a way to have a reliable um, schedule of ships arriving at certain ports, which is where a lot more money started to come into investing for shipping because with how reliable. Investors couldn't necessarily as much rely on sailing vessels, not knowing how long it was going to take to get certain cargoes to certain locations, that sort of thing. The steam vessels also required a larger, less skilled crew. And what I mean by that, not necessarily being less skilled as sailors, but they became more compartmentalized. So you went from a smaller crew to a larger crew where you had some of the crew members were mates. They were focused on piloting the vessel. You had the engineering department. They were focused in the engine room. You also had the deckhands and such. So all those different skills that the schooner crews had were basically split into different sections on the steamers. Another thing to point out, these vessels were more maneuverable and didn't need tows for the rivers. They were more independent, able to get to different places without extra cost. Um, since they were more reliable and they were faster, they began to handle passengers and package freight. So basically, cargo that time mattered. So passengers don't necessarily want to be stuck on a sailing vessel if it isn't guaranteed to get to a certain spot. They would rather take a steamer because they actually had a schedule of when they would show up to a certain harbor or when they would leave, when they would arrive, that sort of thing. Package freight is kind of in reference to anything that's packaged or in barrels, like flour, a lot of materials that are needed for westward expansion of all the settlers moving into the Great Lakes. Um, and that can include a lot of different products. And this is a great quote I found that kind of gives an overall look at how steam changed everything on the Great Lakes with steam technology. From a scholarly article written by Benjamin Ioset. I think he wrote this in 2020. But the revolution in steamship bulk freight transportation in the latter half of the 19th century brought fundamental and far reaching changes to nearly all aspects of maritime life, labor, which we talked about with the cruise management, which we'll get into in a second, and the conduct of commercial transportation on the Great Lakes. Um, because we started using steam vessels with some of these cargoes, there began to be more influence from onshore management, which means there were people onshore that became more involved in the operations, with which captains, I'm sure, did not like. This was kind of a trend that has gone to the point of totally driving crews mad, and even these days with control from the fleet office, as we call it, where they have a difference between what the fleet office is doing and what's happening on the ship, that sort of thing. But steam really introduces that influence where, since ships can reliably show up on certain times, you can have a manager on shore that says, "Oh, we want you to be at this particular place at a certain time, and you can't be because you're a steam vessel," that sort of thing. With it being more efficient, they can make more money that way. And again, nearly all aspects of the operation become scheduled. With these steamships, they were guaranteed to go to certain ports at a certain time, so you can have passengers and package freight going to and from. And then seasonal contracts began to be created with predetermined rates. So, with sailing vessels and to the effect of early steamships, they had they didn't necessarily have seasonal contracts. The captains would basically seek out any cargoes that looked like they would make the most money. And then certain part of the season, certain parts of the year, more cargoes are more or less cargoes have different values. So they would basically go after that. But with steamships, shipping became a lot more reliable on timing. So they could actually make a contract for the entire season for hauling a certain type of cargo in agreements between different companies on how they wanted to tackle it, which brought again more influence from management on shore. Instead of the captain having control over what cargoes they went after, they would be forced to carry one particular cargo throughout the year on a determined route. So this led to the first transit lines, line being basically, at least in this example, kind of a loose association sometimes, or agreement or an alliance, pooling arrangement, whatever you want to call it, between the package freight and passenger steamers. This basically created the first fleets on the Great Lakes where they had multiple vessels under similar management or under the same ownership. These transit lines developed into formerly incorporated companies where they actually incorporated an entity to operate these vessels. With a certain amount of money, you would have officers in different positions in that company, like treasurer, secretary, president, manager, that sort of thing. And these transit lines kind of went from random chartered vessels with various owners. They eventually would become wholly owned by these companies, and this led to more new vessels that were built just for these companies instead of lots of different owners. Um, as far as I understand it, a lot of independent vessels on the lakes at the time, you could buy interest in a vessel. I think there's like it was split into 20ths, I believe, for ownership or less than that. So you could actually have someone buy into a vessel at like 1/20th um, ownership to invest money and be able to get money back from that investment. But in this case, these transit lines were starting to be created where it was groups of people creating the companies to operate them. Um, One of the more famous transit companies at the time was the Anchor Line, which you can see a poster of on the right. They were famous for their package freight and passenger vessels running between Duluth and the lower lakes. They had some of the biggest, best vessels of the time, very recognizable. And the company that operated it was the Erie and Western Transportation Company. Another thing to mention here is that these transportation lines were basically created also by the railroads. The railroads came in as they were building to the Great Lakes. They wanted to extend their transportation network with their own lines of ships. So the Erie and Western Transportation Company, I think, was operated, I want to say, by the New York Central Railway. I could be wrong about that. They're all a lot of the major transit companies though had connections to the railroads for a lot of this history that we're talking about in their own way of extending their influence into the Great Lakes from beyond their rails. So we went through the steam being a huge factor in the creation of these fleets. And now I argue as well the discovery of iron ore and the start of that business on the lakes was also a huge contributing factor to the fleets that were created. So iron ore was discovered in the Upper Peninsula by this guy, William Austin Burt, who was a surveyor. Um, and iron ore was discovered in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in 1844. That discovery would have a huge effect on the entire region and has effects that lasted today with our current trade on the Great Lakes, with iron ore being one of the bigger cargoes moved on these ships. Um, And because of iron ore being discovered, we had the beginnings of what we call the ore fleet, or the fleets that we have today. But a few things had to happen first. One of those things, for since the iron ore was being discovered in Lake Superior, at the time there was no easy way for vessels to get between the lakes across the St. Mary's Rapids. So the original state lock at the Sioux locks that we have today was built in 1855, so that cargo could more easily pass from Lake Superior to the other Great Lakes, and that was huge for especially the development of the movement of iron ore. Because before then, they actually either had to build the ship on the lake, or they had to actually basically move the ship from the lower lakes and portage it up to Lake Superior as well as the cargo. So that made it more efficient, less costly. On the right there, we got a picture of one of Marquette's early ore docks for the more efficient loading of this cargo with the gravity chutes that were added to that dock. Um, and that's a great representation too of all the different types of vessels that were coming in to load this cargo. Early on, there weren't necessarily many vessels that were designed for this trade, but as the trade became more valuable, there were vessels that were built just to handle this kind of cargo. But back in those days, it was any kind of sailing vessel, even the steamship vessels. The package freighters would also handle iron ore. Um, it wasn't very efficient, but it was the one of the earlier methods of moving it down to basically the Cleveland area and the lower lakes. That's where a lot of this development was happening for that movement. So with the movement in iron ore, we have obviously the iron mining companies that become involved and kind of make their way into fleet management on the Great Lakes. So one of the earliest mining companies that was involved in this was the Cleveland Iron Mining Company, which was basically founded soon after the discovery of iron ore. They founded one of the first mines that operate up near Marquette. The Cleveland Iron Mining Company survives today as the Cleveland Cliffs company, that is one of the larger steel and mining producing companies. So it's pretty amazing they have different entities that they can trace back to the 1850s. Um, but one of the people that was involved in uh, founding that company is depicted here, Samuel Livingston Mather. He was president of Cleveland Iron Mining Company and helped found it along with other Cleveland investors. And one problem they were noticing was that um, relying on all these independent vessels coming in to load their cargo wasn't very reliable. Because, as we've talked about, the captains had a lot more control over what cargoes they would go for. Iron ore was not popular for the vessels to transport. There were seasons where it was very much less valuable than loading grain or whatever other cargo, lumber. Iron ore is very dirty to deal with, and a lot of the vessels didn't want to deal with that. That involved more cleaning procedures, that sort of thing. Um, so there were years where when iron ore was very valuable, they would have a lot of ships come in to load it, and other years where ships would not be interested at all at coming to load their iron ore. So, which was a problem for the iron mining company because then they would lose money because they would have less shipments for the steel that they're trying to produce down in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and those lower states. So what they decided to do was that they would buy shares into one of the vessels so they could reliably have at least one ship that was literally just running iron ore between their mines and Cleveland, so that they could keep their make their network more efficient. And this is kind of the entrance and the creation of the ore fleet that we know today. In 1867, they bought half the shares of Barkentine, which is similarly depicted there, where it's basically a schooner that also has those square sails. Um, those were for a time popular in the Great Lakes because they were a little faster. They didn't necessarily last, but because they had 50% shares in the vessel, they would then be able to have a more reliable contract of ore moving to and from their mines and where they unload in Cleveland. So this led to the creation of the Cleveland Cliffs fleet that lasted on the Great Lakes for a long time. Their fleet, since this beginning in the 1860s, their fleet operated all the way up until the 1980s, which is pretty amazing. So over 100 years, Cleveland Cliffs was involved in vessel operations, and today you could argue that they have a fleet, sort of. They've chartered two different vessels, the Wilfred Sykes and the Block, Joseph L. Block, to move their cargo. So you could kind of argue that that's their fleet that's kind of reborn again, but not really. They don't have total control. But after a few years of having that sailing vessel partially owned, they decided to sell it, and they actually decided to form a formal incorporated company called the Cleveland Transportation Company in 1872 to build and operate a larger fleet. And a gentleman by the name of Marcus Hanna, that Hanna name might sound familiar, was brought in to manage those vessels because the iron mining company wasn't as experienced with operating Great Lake ships, but Marcus Hanna was. He became the general manager. The Hanna name comes from, or created the Hanna Mining Company, and operated freighters on the Great Lakes for a long time into the 1980s as well. Marcus Hanna would later become famous too for being a politician um, in I think, in Congress. He was actually very influential and helped get William McKinley uh, basically elected president in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So he became a really famous guy, but at this time he wasn't as well known. People knew that he was experienced at operating and managing vessels. So basically, a new fleet was created for this company, where four new steam freighters and four schooner barges, which were barges that the freighters would tow, were ordered and built. This pack of vessels was known as the Black Fleet for the black painted hulls. So this is one of an earlier examples of what we see today with the different fleets having different colors on their hulls. Um, the 1860s and 70s, we had kind of the first vessels being painted a certain color, depending on what fleet they operated under or what cargo they were carrying. And the Cleveland Transportation Company also had one of the earlier distinctions on their stacks. They had a cream colored stack with a black top, and that would later become a big identification symbol for all the different fleets around the lakes, having different symbols and colors on the stacks. In this case, the reason why you have a black part of the stack, as you can see in that picture, is because black smoke coming out of the stack would actually basically cover up any paint that would be on the stack. So instead of it looking horrible with having a cream color with black soot all over it, you would have a black painted upper part of that stack due to the smoke. Um, but this was kind of the very beginnings of the Cleveland Cliffs fleet that again lasted into the 1980s. So another generation, so the son of this Samuel Mather, who had the same name, he would be involved in the Cleveland Mining Company, but he went on to found the Pickens Mather Company, which today's or the ancestor of today's Interlake Steamship Company, with their 1,000-footers that operate on the Great Lakes. They had a similar start where Samuel Mather decided, similarly to Cleveland Mining, that they would purchase part interest in one of the steam freighters on the Great Lakes, which was the VH Ketchum in 1883, to begin running their own ore from their own mines to where they would unload in Cleveland. And at the time, the VH Ketchum was one of the largest freighters on the Great Lakes. And that's kind of a cool comparison to today, them having the Paul Arturtha in their fleet. But this was when, way before Interlake Steamship Company was founded. But Pickens Mather Company would go on to found the Interlake Steamship Company in 1913. But you can trace their ancestry back to this moment, I would say. So we have the iron mining companies that got involved with creating their own fleets. We also had all the different captains on the Great Lakes creating their own independent fleets, and they would be known as the Independents. All these various fleets that were operating. This is kind of a famous example. Captain Thomas Wilson was a well-known captain on the Great Lakes, and he was the one who created one of the larger fleets at the time under an incorporated company called the Wilson Transit Company, which he formally created in 1890. He started out with one freighter that he built or had ordered and built, the steam freighter D.M. Wilson. By the time he died in 1900, his fleet had 10 bulk freight steamers and one schooner barge, so it was a pretty big fleet for the time. And his fleet would continue operating basically until 1972. So it lasted a long time, again, almost 100 years or so. Or if we're talking about the D.M. Wilson, then we could say about 100 years. Today, that legacy is kind of lives in the history of the Cuyahoga, which unfortunately is going to get scrapped. But that vessel was a part of the Wilson fleet at one time. And the Presque Isle, interestingly, was supposed to be operated by what was left over of the Wilson fleet, but the fleet actually was dissolved and kind of discontinued just before the Presque Isle came out. But it was going to be operated by this fleet. So, and that vessel is still out there today. But basically, this is one of many examples of all the different captains on the Great Lakes. Because of that experience of them managing their own vessels, they would basically invest in growing their own wealth and business by having new vessels built for them and buying used vessels or buying vessels elsewhere and creating their own fleets. There's lots of different examples from this era. W.C. Richardson is a famous one. Bradley, the Minch fleet, which famously became the Kinsman fleet that is no longer existing but has a lot of history on the Great Lakes. You can trace a lot of the major companies today to captains that first formed their own fleets, like American Steamship or um, not necessarily Interlake, but um, I think American Steamship is kind of the main example of that, having that captain background. Fleets were also created, interestingly enough, from shipyards as well. Fleets started to expand to basically become more in control of how their ships were being built and how they were operating. Famous example being the whalebacks that were created. That was the American Steel Barge Company, where Captain Alexander McDougall, you can see there, he's the one who founded the company, designed these freighters, built them himself, and operated them. A fleet having its own shipyard was a huge advantage because they would then be able to fix their own vessels at lower, more efficient costs when other fleets would have to buy the services of their shipyard to have either a new vessel built or have something fixed. This wasn't the only fleet that had its own shipyard. The Davidson Steamship Company was famous for having their own shipyard that built their own vessels for their fleet. And there were lots of these fleet owners who were invested in the different shipyards around the Great Lakes indirectly too, as an advantage for their newer vessels being built. So another significant step in the development of the fleets is the creation of the Lake Carriers Association, which was basically formed in 1880 as the Cleveland Vessel Owners Association, it wasn't all the American vessel owners on the lakes at the time, but it was a good portion of them, the major ones. They wanted to basically unite and deal with certain issues that they've been noticing in their operations. They wanted to, as a group, address navigation and infrastructure issues, so like channel depth, where channels are being dug, lighthouses, that sort of thing. Basically, as a group to advocate for the industry to the federal government. They will also work together to reduce accidents and financial losses. So, whenever ships would get into accidents and sink, they wanted to work together to help keep that from happening so that their businesses wouldn't be affected continuously for big problems like the Lake Carriers Association famously kind of set a lot of the different routes that the ships take these days around the Great Lakes. They set those routes because ships kept running into each other because there were unofficial routes that they would use. So they helped create that um, those official trade routes so that ships would quit running into each other. And they also famously were created to help the vessel owners kind of fight against the sailors' unions that were growing around the Great Lakes. Obviously, the sailors' unions would come in and mess with the money they're trying to make in the business, and basically force the owners to create kind of their own union of sorts to fight against that. And that was pretty common at the time. The sailors' unions, unfortunately, were pretty disorganized. So the Lake Carriers Association was pretty effective at fighting those unions for a long time. But these days, each ship has, depending on what position you're working on, you're in a union. Basically, unions have been fully integrated onto all the different ships on the Great Lakes. So Obviously, the Lake Carriers Association lost that fight, but early on, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were pretty effective at doing it um, because of all that disorganization on the other side of all this. So now we come to kind of the last topic here I'll address, vertical integration. So the fleets that were being developed by these mining and steel companies in the late 1800s, um, the best way for them to make the most amount of money and make the most efficient system was vertical integration, where they would own their iron mines. They would own basically the whole system of the mines, the railroads, the docks, the fleets, and they would then own the docks that they unload at, as well as the steel mills where the steel is being made. So um, there were already companies that were moving towards this operation, Pickin Ma being one of them. They became more vertically integrated company. But the famous example here that we're talking about is the formation of U.S. Steel in 1901. That's kind of the biggest example, and that would have a huge effect on all the different fleets that operate on the lakes. And of course, if you're not familiar with the story behind U.S. Steel, we had some of the biggest mining and steel operating firms on the Great Lakes at the time. John D. Rockefeller, he was invested in lots of different iron mines, had his own steamship company to move that ore to control the cost of it. Andrew Carnegie in the middle, huge famous figure for the uh, steel industry at the time. Again, had his own huge steel company, one of the biggest steel producers in the United States. Had his own fleet to move some of that cargo. And obviously, these aren't the only people involved. These are just kind of the major characters at the time. And then we had J.P. Morgan, who was the investment banker basically behind forming U.S. Steel, along with several others. And basically, he was able to combine or get John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie to sell their interest in those companies to combine it into one massive corporation that we know as U.S. Steel in 1901, where they would have pretty much vertical integration all the way down from the mines to the steel mills. It was the largest company by far at the time. It was the first billion-dollar corporation, became the largest industrial firm in the world at the time. And as a result, to move that iron ore, they would have to create the largest fleet that would actually ever exist on the Great Lakes. And to fuel all the different steel mills that were a part of the company at that time. And to, as I said, fuel the largest company in the world, you have to have the largest fleet operating. So what happened is there were 6 different fleets involved with different iron mine companies and steel mills, 2 of them being Rockefeller's and Carnegie's. There were 112 vessels that were combined into one fleet from 6 different entities. And a lot of work was put in. It was a huge task of bringing all these fleets together to operate as one. And famously, Augustus B. Wolven, famous here in Duluth, was appointed general manager of this massive fleet. And he had a lot of experience in being an agent for the steamship companies up here in Duluth and across the Great Lakes. U.S. Steel at the time would need about 13 million tons of iron ore a year to keep their furnaces running. And the fleet itself, even with those 112 vessels they had, could only transport about 10 million a year. As a result, there was lots of business that the independent fleets that were operated by all the other captains and mining companies, they were able to get in on the business as well, because they used not just their own fleet, but lots of other fleets, especially on really busy years where they had extra product to move. And the fleet was called Pittsburgh Steamship famously. Today, the modern version of it is called Great Lakes Fleet. But the Pittsburgh Steamship Company became probably one of the best examples of a true modern fleet that we have today. Because of this massive fleet, there was a lot of work that went into organizing supply, fuel, dispatching where those vessels would go. Onshore personnel was huge in operating this fleet, having an onshore fleet engineer that looked over the whole fleet for uh, different issues vessels were having, to seeing what needed to be fixed on each vessel, that sort of thing. They operated two different offices. There was an office up here in Duluth on the start of the system, and there was a office down in Cleveland where one of the where the fleet would end up a lot was in Cleveland. Um, they dealt with all these different issues with this massive fleet. The fleet itself was actually the largest fleet in the world at the time, much larger than the U.S. Navy, other navies. Um, it was just massive, and was kind of dominant because of how big this fleet was and the dominance of U.S. steel. They were actually able to influence the iron ore, the rates that were put out for how much money these fleets would be making. They had a huge influence over everything, and basically they had a monopoly. But there were a lot of different other fleets that were operating too, so I wouldn't say it's a full monopoly, but they were definitely had a huge influence over absolutely everything. Um, Trying to think if there was one last thought I had. Another thing that was had to be created for this massive fleet was supply. Was they had their own warehouse that to basically supply their vessels more efficiently. They had a warehouse that was built and operated up in Sault Ste. Marie, and that kind of operates today as Sioux Supply with their vessel, the Ojibwe. Um, the vessel would go out to vessels as they went by and load supplies onto the ship as it was moving, either upbound or downbound. And they really went far into needing all their different docks and um, being able to make this as efficient as possible to use up the least amount of money. Another important thing to point out too is that Pittsburgh Steamship Company, since it was integrated, they weren't necessarily looking for the fleet to make money. They were using the fleet to basically make their steel, to make money off of their steel. So it was kind of incorporated into the cost. All the independent fleets at the time had to worry about getting business, but Pittsburgh Steamship was just worried about moving iron ore for the steel mill. And since they were kind of integrated in the middle of the entire system. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that you all might be wondering about that I didn't address, but that's kind of a good understanding of how the fleets formed from 1800 to 1901. So I'll switch it back over to Sarah before we address any questions. If anyone has anything, I'll stop sharing here. Oh, perfect.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everyone, again for joining us today. I just have a couple of updates for our respective visitor centers, and then we'll get to any questions you might have. If you thought of any, you can put those in the chat right now, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. We are approaching the end of the shipping season. January 15th, the Soo Locks will close for about 2 months for the season. So our visitor center is going to go to our winter schedule, which will be Friday through Sunday from 10 a.m. until 4:30. Next week, starting next week, we've got our cell phone tours outdoors and virtual online tour of the visitor center available. At the Soo Locks Visitor Center, the visitor center is closed and until May 1st, but the park is open from 9 a.m. until 6 p.m. And once again, our program next week is going to be a talk with a first mate. So that'll be an interesting talk about a younger person in their career. That'll be Thursday, February 6th at 11:30 a.m. Central or 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And we will get to questions right now. And then I'm just going to keep this slide up for your information. This is just some helpful links and information about what we're doing, how to connect with us on social media, etc. So I will
Awesome.
get the questions now. So I think the first one is, when were the ports being made at that time?
So it depends on what part of the lakes you're looking at. Obviously, at the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center, we kind of focus on our ports up here in Lake Superior, but obviously the oldest ports are closer to where the as far down the system as you can get. The oldest ports on the Great Lakes first developed on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So Buffalo was one of the older ports that we have operating. We got Toledo and Detroit, Chicago, and the other major ports in Lake Michigan, 1830s, 1840s, and then Lake Superior was the last lake to really have major ports developed. So really, a lot of the ports 1830s through the 1850s, and by about 1870, that's when Duluth became a port up here. But what really created the ports that we have today are the development of those bulk cargoes that were moved, beginning with the iron ore industry, as well as coal and grain and all that sort of thing. So I hope that gives a general idea of when the ports were being made. So they were developing as these fleets were developing too at the time. And I also see from Jordan here mentioning a potential part two. Would the next presentation take us to modern day in terms of the evolution of American steamship vessels versus interlake? Potentially, yes. I'm thinking a part two would focus on the Canadian side of development, how the St. Louis Sea or St. Lawrence Seaway was huge in their development of becoming the big fleets that we have today, Algoma Central and such. But I probably would also get into kind of the disappearance of a lot of the American independent fleets over time, as well as how American Steamship and Interlake became some of the bigger fleets we have today with the huge corporations that kind of invested in their operations. So yes, probably Jordan, I would address something like that. I hope so too, Beth. Yeah, you guys are welcome. Thank you for watching the presentation today. If anyone has any other questions, we'll be here, next few minutes here.
Scott, did you in your research for this, did you find anything really surprising or interesting?
I've always thought that steam was huge and like the evolution of ships. I didn't realize that the development of steam was huge in the development of the fleets as well. The whole culture of how a vessel operated totally changed. I thought that was really interesting. There were a couple different scholarly articles I was looking at that kind of focused on that. So as well as like labor relations, that part of it too was kind of interesting. Maybe that would be a good future presentation, talking about how unions formed on the Great Lakes and their kind of struggles and what the ones that we have today, that sort of thing.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing.
What ships are spending the winter in Duluth? So we have about 8 ships that will be spending the winter here. There's going to be Honorable James L. Oberstar and Lee A. Tregurtha at Fraser. There's going to be Walter J. McCarthy Jr., John J. Boland, and the American Century. At the I'm not sure what docks those are going to, but and then Atlantic Huron is already here. That's our first layup there at Port Terminal. We're going to have the Presque Isle, and the Mishpacotton is also at Fraser Shipyard, so I would include that as winter layup. And I think that covers it. But so it'll be a decent sized winter layup fleet this year. A lot of the ships will be laying up on the American side in Ashtabula and Toledo, and a lot of the Canadian ships are obviously going to be in Sarnia, Port Weller, those locations. Let's see, have I looked into why some ports are not being used? So in this presentation, it's a lot about development up into kind of the peak of all the different ports that were being used. So I haven't gotten to why some of these ports have fallen into not being used or used very little, like you said. Like, for example, some different ports that used to be used a lot more might be like Milwaukee and Green Bay don't see nearly as many ships as they used to, 100 years ago, that sort of thing. Buffalo doesn't see nearly as many vessels as they used to 100 years ago. So that would be something to tackle in that part 2 presentation.
All right, I think that is all the questions that we've got. Again, if anyone has any other ones, we'll be back next month, or you can connect with us via our email, our Gmail, or Facebook, social media. Thanks again for attending, and have a good month, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.